Welcome to another episode of the Steeple Report. Today we have Carl Chinn, who's the president of the faith-based security network, church security. Is it church security network or just security network?
Faith-based security network.
Okay. I wanted to stick church in there. But
well, we have a lot of non-church ministries, and I can talk more about that later.
Okay, great. So welcome, Carl. Carl and I met a couple years ago when he was in this part of the country. He resides in Colorado, but he was in this part of the country doing a workshop seminar, and so we got to meet each other. So I'm pleased to welcome you to the Steeple Report. So why don't you just spend a little time so we can get to know you, a little about your background and how you found your way into the security world and specifically working with churches and houses of worship.
Well, thank you, Rich, and I appreciate it. I'm glad to see you again. That was actually pre-COVID that you and I met at that church there in Virginia Beach, and it was just not very far but pre-COVID.
No, I think it was just a few months before this all descended upon us.
Yeah, but no, I told somebody just the other day, Rich, that if you'd have told me in high school that, or even shortly after as a young man starting a family, if you had told me that I would someday be talking to audiences that are Christian and have a lot of law enforcement in them, I'd have said you're out of your mind. I come, all of us have a backstory, and my backstory, let's just put it this way. When somebody comes to me and tells me about one of their children going off the rails and giving them trouble, I just tell them my dad had a kid like that. And, I did take quite a wild turn as a young man. And even when I came back to the Lord in 1979 as a 21-year-old, I didn't think twice about security. It was the farthest thing from my mind, Rich. I don't have a law enforcement background. I don't have a military background. I can't really say that I don't have protection in my DNA because I grew up in Kansas, rural, and you do protect things, but it was not a priority and it was not intentional. And I tell folks there's many things. I consider probably the first 30 years of my adult life, 20 years anyway, as a continuing wake-up call. It was like I kept getting these little hints about security and I kept hitting the snooze button. And, when you say, how did I get into security? The way you worded that reminded me that I was working for Focus on the Family in the early 90s. And we got a bomb threat and on Dr. Dobson's car. And a few weeks later, we got another bomb threat on the building. And we co-occupied that building with several other companies while we were building our new campus. And those other companies were kind of angry about back-to-back bomb threats and being evacuated for a certain amount of time. So the building owner had called together us as Focus on the Family and the other tenants so we could have a meeting on this. And for Focus on the Family, it was me as the building engineer and one other guy who was an assistant to the president. And there's about a dozen of us seated around a table, Rich, and these other tenants in the building were wanting to know, what are you doing about all your threats? And I kid you not, the assistant to the president said, well, that's a good question. And I got to tell you, Carl is working on a plan. And that was the first I knew about it. So when people say, how did you get into security? My mind always goes back to that meeting at a conference table in Colorado Springs in 1992. And
did you ever find out who was responsible for those threats?
Not those or the others that followed. Most bomb threats in those days, at least, were and still are difficult to track.
Unless they take credit for it, right?
Yeah, law enforcement's gotten better all the time, but for those particular back-to-back, no, we never found out. Colorado Springs is a hotbed of opinions, just like any other city. And Colorado Springs is the often referred to as the evangelical capital of the West. There's more evangelical faith-based ministries headquartered in Colorado Springs than any other city in the nation.
I didn't know that.
Yep. We surpassed Wheaton, Illinois back in the mid 90s. And so there's just so many ministries based here. And Rich, that's not necessarily popular with the whole population. There's plenty of people who are not happy about that.
Yeah, my understanding of Colorado Springs, it's that's where what, Colorado State is?
No, this is University of Colorado College.
Okay.
College.
Okay. Yeah, I just for whatever reason thought of it as yeah, I just kind of thought of it as more of a college town, and that surprised me. Okay.
I think that's Fort Collins. You're probably thinking of Fort Collins. That's where Colorado State University is.
Okay. Yeah.
And Colorado Springs has got a lot of liberal influence. There's no question on that. A lot of gay rights activity here. I remember when I came out here in '91 on contract, told my wife, I said, it's a very diverse culture. You got your cowboys and your hippies, you got the Army and the Air Force, and you got a strong Christian presence, and you got a very strong satanic presence, and all this diversity stuff going on, and liberal agenda. It's a very diverse community, and about 500,000 people.
Well, that's a good sized city then. So yeah, I mean, with a city of 500,000, you're going to have a pretty diverse population. So that follows. But so, it's obvious that you came to it in the way you did, to the security world. What followed those incidences? I mean, I guess you just dove in, gained an expertise, and it set you on a road down this path, and so let's fill in the blanks of how you built this network that we know today.
Well, yeah, I'd like to say that right after the bomb threats, I got really serious. I didn't, Rich. Bomb threats launched us into some committee meetings, and Focus on the Family is not a church, it's a ministry, but it's enough like a ministry that it operates with committees. It's enough like a church that it operates with committees. So we put together a committee, to think about what are we going to do about safety and security. And since I was the building engineer and working with architects and engineers and our director of site support services, who was planning the whole building operations, I brought forth some, security things, some cameras and access control and advanced fire alarm. And, Rich, it was like checking off boxes of due diligence and saying, well, I got security and safety done. I'm done. I'm on to more fun things. And so I didn't really get it yet. I didn't. It was just kind of a back thought. We decided we'd go ahead and as a ministry, we recommended that we hire a security position. We didn't even want to call it a security guard, because that would have, a bad ring to it. You can't have a security guard at a ministry. So, our first recommendation as a committee was, let's get a security position in here. We went ahead and hired a guy that was a parking lot attendant to lead security. That's that, and the fact that he was entered into a criminal justice program seemed to be enough qualifications to put somebody in there in this security position. And so the ministry did that. We moved into our new buildings in July of 1993. And as a building engineer, that's when I went into what we call a shakedown cruise in a new building, you know, working through all the warranty issues of the first year and code issues and, you know, stuff that goes wrong. So I was very busy working with the contractor and the city and the authorities having jurisdiction, making sure that our building was working like it should. And then April 19th, 1995 happened. That was the Oklahoma City bombing.
Right.
We had just come through a year and a half of being in the building, so the warranty period was over. We were pretty well settled in. We were building a new building, but it was just 26,000 square feet. So it was, that's like building a garage after building, you know, 400,000 square feet back to back. So we were settling into this new building, and everything was kind of working like it should. And then Oklahoma City happened, and the leaders at Focus asked a team of us to start to put together a plan and take a look at our ministry and see, were we ready for something like that? So we did. We recommended some things. We installed some things. We changed some things. And, you know, with a ministry, it takes a long time. You got to identify what you're going to do, how much it's going to cost, get it approved for next year's budget, blah, blah, blah. So we got it all approved, and it was a year later. We had not yet tested some of those systems when one of those systems went off, and on my radio, just told where the incident was at, said administration building front desk. And I honestly thought that it was some receptionist seeing, what's this new button do? I wasn't expecting there to be anything there, Rich. And I went down the steps, and as a building manager, building engineer, we had this little saying in facilities. We said, what gets measured gets managed. And so, you know, I'm a guy that I work off blueprints and AutoCAD and, you know, scale and time and measures. So I'm going towards this incident, literally looking at my watch and tracking for how long is it going to take me to get there if this was a real incident. And I walked right up to the front desk, still looking at my watch, because nothing's ever going to happen here. And still looking at my watch. And I remember thinking very clearly, wow, 17 seconds. I could be here pretty quick if there was a real issue. And I looked up, and I was face to face with a gunman. And that led into a hostage situation. And I was one of the 4 hostages in that. And the hostage portion of the building takeover ended about an hour and a half into it. That's when we were let go. And then he stayed in there, holding off SWAT teams, et cetera, for another 4.5 hours before he was talked out.
Were you released? Were you released as part of a negotiation with the police that they talked him into letting you go?
That is correct. He had a death wish. He wanted to go suicide by cop. And so we were just tools that he was using, and a very skilled negotiator who I became friends with later. In fact, I interviewed with him a few months ago, even though that was, goodness, what was that, 25 years or more ago. But, and he told me about the things he said to him. He said, if you'll lay down your weapon and come out the front of the building, he said, I will make sure every news agency in Southern Colorado is filming you, and your story will be told. If you force our law enforcement officers to kill you, I will do everything in my power to have your body taken out the back of the building, and nobody can see it, and I will suppress all the news I can. And he said that was the thing that got this guy to give up and come out. In fact,
they say typically that these types of assailants typically are seeking some kind of platform for their grievances. So, yeah,
he'd been injured on our property. He was a subcontractor of the general contractor when we were building the buildings. I was there the day he was hurt. I remembered it very well, and it was a very tragic injury. It was a very traumatic injury. It was a life-changing injury, but it was horseplay. And since he got injured doing horseplay, the state workers' compensation limited his financial rewards, you might say. And so he was extremely limited by that, sued everybody he could, tried to get compensation, and was angry at our ministry and came back to make a statement. And, and that's one thing I tell churches, Rich, you never know what's in the mind of somebody that walks through your door. You don't know what past grievance that they're holding or imagined grievance. It's you just don't know when somebody's walking through your door.
Yeah, I think recently I was speaking with a mutual friend of ours, Bob Chauncy, and I actually interviewed him, but that interview has not been posted yet. But I was telling him that my business partner, who's a pastor at an African American denomination church, that in the town that they're in, there was a series of vandalism that happened at, I think it was 4 area black churches within a very short period of time. And so there was the assumption that, it was, some kind of racially motivated, a person that was racially motivated. As it turned out, it was an African-American gentleman who felt that the church had not gone out of its way to help him in his time of need. And, he felt like the church had turned his back. I think there were some mental health issues involved as well.
That's a whole new category that we consider fake hate. And it happens quite often on both sides, fake hate.
Yeah. And so, it was just nothing that anybody assumed it was. And people made some judgments, because it happened all so quickly that seemed the most logical. But turned out it was just somebody who, their perception was that, the church or churches had turned their back on him, and this was his way of acting out. So you never know. It could have gone, it could have gone way beyond vandalism. And so we had those discussions that, if he had been armed and had, more severe intent, what could have happened then? And I think it woke some people up to thinking about it, because the AME Church in South Carolina was, I think, a year or two before that. So that was on the tops of their minds as well.
Mm-hmm. After the focus on the family thing, I started studying this. How often does this happen? And is this a real issue? Is it something worthy of being concerned about? And I began keeping statistics, as you probably know, and measuring different things. And one category that I especially go after is what I call deadly force incidents. It's very difficult to track everything that happens at a church, but it's easier to track those very high scale, deadly force level incidents. And as I began tracking those, I also began in the late 90s and early 2000s talking with various churches about and ministries like Focus. That's what I mean by a faith-based organization, is not necessarily a church, but, a charity, a homeless shelter, somebody like that. And all of them face the same denial. God's in control. There's a cross over our building, or there's a sign on the front that says we're here as a charitable organization. Who could possibly want to hurt us? We feed the homeless. So as I began doing my research, I began realizing that this is a big issue, partially because of what I just said, the soft target mentality of churches and faith-based organizations.
Yeah. And the thing that, not specific to churches or nonprofits or what have you, but in general, a lot of these large scale incidences, when you dig below the surface, disproportionately there's mental health issues involved. Typically these are not, well-adjusted people. There is something that is driving them toward this kind of hatred. And that's hard for law enforcement, hard for anybody to judge, you know, both how much of a grudge or how much of a distorted perception and what they're going to do about it. It's very hard to police
You
up
bet
front.
you bet it is. And they're in a tough position because they're there to protect the public. And in much the same way, security operators at a ministry there for the same reason. We're there to protect people, but at the same time, we and police officers, especially police officers who deal with this as a living all day, every day, uh, they're required to analyze the whole, what they call the totality of the circumstances. And is this a guy somewhere way deep in the spectrum of autism, or is this somebody having a diabetic reaction and they can't listen to what somebody's telling them? Or is this person really out there to do harm? And here's the catch 22. Even though the police officer has to be aware of all those other things, his primary thing is protection of the innocent. His primary thing is not what's going through that person's mind or why it's going through that person's mind. Yet his actions are judged on that. The fact of the matter is, he has a responsibility to protect people first and foremost. He can't be consumed at that moment when somebody's got a knife and running at somebody, or a gun and shooting at somebody, or in some other way threatening bodily harm. That police officer or even a security operator sure needs to be aware of all those mental illness issues, but that can't dictate their response. Their response is to protect the innocent.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he has to take the circumstances as he sees them. And like you said, you know, if there are lives in danger, that's his primary concern. And what's motivating the person, while important, is more of an after thing that has to be analyzed rather than, you know, I guess for a negotiator, if violence hasn't begun or the threat is undetermined, you know, then, you know, if there's a negotiator like your hostage situation, you know, then there could be an assessment, you know, through dialogue, but that's not always the case. I mean, a lot of these, a lot of times people are dead by the time the police even arrive. So, you know, they're dealing in the aftermath more than they are sometimes even the incident that's, you know, occurred.
That's right. And, you know, those of us in security roles or those in law enforcement, uh, you know, and really to a degree, especially those in security roles, are what I call at the bang. A friend of mine, Jason Van Horn, wrote a book called Left of Bang, which is very interesting, and it has all that pre-planning stuff and trying to figure out what's going to happen before it happens, which is wonderful. I bless that work. I hope it continues sound and that people learn and can avoid as many of these things as possible. It's A+ top shelf work, Left of Bang. And then there's SWAT training and all of that stuff that goes in for law enforcement, that responding to a call. They're called emergency first responders for a reason. They're going to it, but first response is often too late. The people are, for the most part, injured or dead by the time they get there. And, you know, every one of those law enforcement officers would give their right arm to be there in time to stop it. I know that. That's in their heart. But most of the time, it's already over by the time they get there. And then there's that middle group of people, which is the on-site ready, what I call responsible defenders. They're at the bang. And that's when stuff goes down very quick. And they've got to be ready to make those split-second decisions that they're going to be judged on for years. But they got to be able to make those split-second decisions. And again, they can't get too caught up in the why this is happening. They have to focus on the fact that it is happening.
Well, you know, since you know what we've been talking about is the reactionary part of the equation. Your organization obviously deals in that, but the prevention is, what's really important. So maybe you can go over kind of some of the best practices for churches large and small, and other organizations large and small, things that they should be doing that have been proving effective.
Sure, be glad to. And that's tied directly to my own personal journey as well, because after the focus thing and I began teaching across the state, one of the churches that needed security was the largest church in Colorado, which was where I attended. And in 2005, I sent an email to our site administrator, a very good friend of mine, and told him what I was discovering about safety and security in churches. He said, "You know what? You're not alone. There's a couple law enforcement officers here in the church who are also concerned about it. Why don't you guys get together and hash out a plan?" And we did. And that was in March of 2005 when we started hashing out our plan. And then about a year later, one of those, the team leader of that, who was himself a law enforcement officer, decided we needed to authorize some members of the security team, or what we called and still call the life safety ministry, to be armed. And so a few of us got armed and were prepared to face a deadly force incident if it came to our church. And it did, in fact, come to our church on December 9th, 2007. Had a guy who was angry at Christians. I'm going to take just a little bit of a side jaunt here as I answer your question. But he was angry at Christians. He had attacked a YWAM in Arvada, Colorado, just 77 miles to our north, about shortly after midnight. Injured some, killed two, disappeared into the night. Nobody knew where he was going. In between then and the time he showed up at our church, he wrote 13 suicide diatribes. And in one of those, he said, like Cho, Eric Harris, Ricky Rodriguez, and others, "I'm going out to make a stand against this sick, evil religion." And then he wrote in bold, "Christian America, this is your Columbine." And he came to our church, started shooting about 40 minutes after our services had ended. So most of our people had gone. We still had about 700 on campus. And 4 of us met him in the hallway. And one of our armed team members was up closer to him than I was. And she engaged him and stopped him right there. She wounded him. And then he put the gun in his own mouth and pulled the trigger. This was after he'd already killed 2 innocent girls in the parking lot and injured 2 others. And Rich, here's the side jaunt that I wanted to take. You said something a while ago. There's something mentally wrong with anybody who would do any of this. I mean, yeah, some of them have been diagnosed as mentally ill, but there's something off the rocker with everybody. And it's the same way with hate. Hate crime is an agenda-based legislation. That's all it is, because every one of these is hate. You don't kill somebody without hatred in your heart. I don't care what color their skin is and what color yours is. You don't kill somebody without extreme hate.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be schizophrenia or something diagnosed. I mean,
no, and that's right.
There's hate in somebody's heart. That's something equally as horrific that could drive somebody to these kinds of acts. Yeah.
And in our case, in our attack that happened December 9th, 2007, you can go into the FBI Department of Justice records. Anybody can research them. You can pull up hate crimes for 2007, and they will tell you that there wasn't a single homicide aside from sexual or racial base. There wasn't a single religious hate-based homicide in 2007, even though our killer said, "Christian America, this is your Columbine." We were the wrong religion. We were the wrong people group. It doesn't qualify as a hate group if you're going to kill Christians. And anybody can double check me on that. Go into the Department of Justice records and pull hate crimes for 2007. You'll see, as I recall, 13 of them that were homicides. Not one of them was against any particular type of religion. All of them were against either people of color or gay lifestyle. And what I mean by that, should those be qualified as hate crimes? Absolutely, they are. Those 13 that they listed for 2007, those are hate crimes. But so is everything else. You don't kill somebody without hate in your heart.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, all hate crime legislation, by definition was targeting a person or persons, or, if you're talking about vandalism, it's the representation of those people or persons. For that hold a particular, view or what have, so religion is obviously one, like you mentioned. LGBTQ is another. Yeah. That, it's a group, or it could be ethnic, or it could be, whatever that is, those are categories that are, legal definitions that have to do with hate crime legislation.
Right.
But to your point, yeah, you don't even contemplate doing bodily injury or murdering somebody unless there's hate. So by definition, yeah, murder is a hate crime, or any kind of violence is a hate crime.
Yep.
So, you told us about the incident, so why don't you tell us more about, best practices for security teams, and, more the preparation part, that might get people thinking, in terms of, are they considering these things, and what should they do to get at least started?
Well, as I began considering all these things that I had been involved in, I suddenly, well, shouldn't say suddenly, that's about as inaccurate of a word as possible. I eventually stopped hitting the snooze button and started listening to what the Lord was saying. And I honestly believe that there is a wake-up call going on in this country. And so what I wanted to do was put together a mechanism where people could connect with each other. And the more I began looking at what we needed in this country on this topic, and I call it a great endeavor. Some people call it a business or an industry. Some people call it church security. I call it faith-based security. And I don't consider it a business. I consider it a great endeavor. It's a grassroots effort. And people from the East Coast to the West Coast, from Canada to Mexico, border to border, are starting to formulate plans for their ministries. And as different things happen, more and more people are recognizing and stopping hitting their own snooze buttons and doing something about it. But there's no organization to it. All the organization that I saw was company-based. In other words, a company that offers a solution that is the owner of that company's idea for what needs to be done. And it's a business plan is what it is. And I have no problem to somebody who's got a business plan of doing training.
I mean, you need people who fill certain needs, but yeah.
Absolutely. But we also needed an association. We needed a networking, a membership association, and that was in my heart. And so I launched the Faith-Based Security Network as a 501c3 nonprofit organization on August 1st of 2016. We didn't get our 501c3 approval until October of 2017. You know, that's quite a process to work through all that. And then we started taking members in February of 2018. And now we have over 600 members in 45 states and Washington, D.C. And the things that the Faith-Based Security Network does is one, as you say, we share best practices. I like to consider that whole category best in class. Best in class practices and best in class resources. And for best practices, one of the things that we put out for folks, in fact, I'll send you a copy of this. If people write you, they can get it. One of the things we put together is 10 things that every church or faith-based organization should do related to safety. And I'll freely give that to your program, and people can write you and get a copy of that if you want. That's one document that we put out to the public. And it just goes through these 10 things that any church security program needs to have. And then we break it up even further after that. And each one of those becomes a major category, and then there's subcategories that go with that. And it's not based on one person's idea. It's collective acumen of the membership. And we have groups, we call them SIGs, special interest groups. We have one special interest group that all they do is they look at training standards and certifications. We have another group that all they do is look at building standard operating procedures. We have another group that's just best practices. They analyze best practices that come in from different people, and they meet as a group and they say, well, this is good. This may not be good. Had one guy one time write in, and his solution for his older church was everybody should always wear a coat even in the summertime. And if there's an active shooter, everybody rush the shooter and throw your coats over him. Well, that one didn't make it to past the editing. That might be a great idea in a really remote situation. It's one of those things where you're looking at all your options and you just might do that. But to put it out there as a best practice, probably not going to do that. So we have this, what I like to refer to as collective acumen. It's experienced, seasoned people who have been doing this for a long time. In a large church, in a small church, in a medium church. We have all types of groups in there. And what works well for a church of 50 people in rural Alabama is not necessarily the thing that's going to work at a mega church in Seattle, Washington. And so there's demographic particulars in there. And so we analyze all of that. So there's best practices. Then there's also threat information, threat sharing. We try to put out things for folks that alerts them as to something that may be happening. And these are mostly to help them understand some current threat to churches in a certain area or across the United States. So we've developed a pretty safe model of sharing sensitive but not classified information. And we've been criticized a little bit by that, by some really churchy people. They say, you mean you'd keep a file on somebody? And we say, sure, Paul did. He warned Timothy, watch out for Alexander the metal worker.
Yeah, I remember from the seminar that I attended that you had a speaker. It wasn't you, I think, that was speaking about that, and what they were saying was that that's kept pretty close to the vest because you don't want to just widely disseminate information about an individual because regardless they have privacy rights as well. But when it becomes a local thing, there are people in certain areas, maybe it's a city or a county in a rural area that have had growing levels of incidences, and so there needs to be a concern if they're showing animus towards a religious group or what have you. That's something worth noting. And it's not about convicting without proof or anything of that nature or taking action against them. It's just, like you said, awareness.
That's exactly right. And there are actors in every environment, every major metropolitan area. There's actors of different kinds that are button pushers or uh, belligerent benevolence seekers or pedophiles. And listen, they do not care what name is over the top of your church. They don't care what denomination or theology you are. They're just looking for a target-rich environment. And when it comes to things like pedophiles, there's so many people that want to say that's a Catholic problem. That's not a Catholic problem. That's a pervasive problem in our immoral.
That's a cultural problem. Yeah.
That's a cultural problem, and it's across all denominations. And the number one reason year after year after year that churches are in a court of law, in a court proceeding, is for sexual abuse of a child. And Rich, you know, because you sat through one of my seminars, that's not the pedophile down the street, the guy that's on the registered sex offender registry. It's the youth pastors. It's people who have wiggled into the church so that they can be, or gotten in for the right motives and then got pulled off, you know, like Lot. He camped too close to the enemy. You know, there's good people all throughout history who have camped too close to the enemy and got pulled into that thing. And for whatever reason, they've become a pedophile, and they're a leader in the church, a youth leader, a song leader, a teacher, senior pastors.
Yeah, they can come from any walk of
life.
Into
that thing. But if there's somebody going through your community with some sort of a scam, it is right to alert the other churches. Hey, this guy's going to come and he's going to ask for benevolence. He's going to give you a story that his mom and dad are both in a cancer unit in a hospital, and he hasn't really even had any relationship with his mom or dad in 40 years. And he's looking for a handout. And even, and we're not telling churches to shut down their benevolence program. Not at all. We would never say that. And I get misquoted sometimes, but we would never tell people to stop reaching out to those who need it, the homeless, the mentally ill, the down on their luck people. You know, folks need it. I've needed it in the past.
Of course. I mean, that's our calling as Christians is to be benevolent and to give that outreached hand to those in need. So, yeah, that's
do it with both eyes open. Do it aware that things can and do happen, and that's one reason why the FBSN exists, is to put that message out there that there are bad things that happen to good people, and sometimes you could have a cross over the top of your door and still happen there.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges from an approach standpoint from a church, is that our grounding in our faith is one of welcoming, but simultaneously that opens us up further, if we're not taking the proper precautions, because in a church, we have these programs where it's, invite people to come to your church, so oftentimes new faces is a good thing, but it all has to be couched with, people that are looking at it, maybe not from the same perspective as a pastor or a member. These things have to be, parallel to one another. But somebody has to be looking at it from a little different point of view.
You just said something that's very critical to what I tell my audiences often when I'm traveling and speaking. And, a lot of news and other people want to ask the question, what makes security in a church different than security anywhere else? And a popular response to that is, well, we have to remain welcome and opening. No, that's not what makes us different, because a bar or a bistro has to be opening and welcoming, open arms and welcoming. A church, the thing that makes us different, Rich, is that we are first and foremost an ambassador of Christ. We have to stand in that gap of welcoming everybody and being ready to help them. Every church out there, their goal really should be making it hard for people to go to hell from your area. That should be the, oh, I didn't turn my phone off, just a second. That should be, making it hard for people to go to hell should be the main thing that your church does. And as a security operator, we cannot be opposed to that goal. We have to be an ambassador of Christ, because a lot of those people, those guests that you've just talked about that come into our church every week or on some sort of regular basis, they're already well on their way to hell. Some of them are not good actors. And we hope that we can introduce every one of those to Christ. But the one who comes in with nefarious purposes, and he's not there at all to better his life or her life, and they're there like the, in Matthew, I'm trying to think, I think it's the 22nd chapter, where Jesus was telling about the banquet. A lot of these people have come to the banquet, and they're wearing clothes. They have attitudes and attire that is not representative of what God calls all of us to do. I love the old song, "Just As I Am." He called us all just as we were. But many people, to them, it's just as I am and always will be. No, that's not in the request. And are we going to be perfect? No, we're not going to be perfect, but we should strive every day to be closer to God than we were yesterday.
Right.
And we some of these people have no intention of trying to change. They justify their sin, they justify their attire, and say, no, you invited me, so this is okay, and I'm going to get in here and I'm going to cause trouble. No, you're not at our church. and the good steward of security, the good responsible defender, will recognize those who are doing nothing but disruption. And just like that parable that Jesus told of in the 22nd, I'm pretty sure it's 22nd chapter of Matthew, said they'll be bound up and thrown out, hands and feet. And that may sound harsh to some people, but listen, we have an attack going on in this country against morality. There is right and wrong. There is a God and there's Satan, and they are enemies.
Yeah.
And Satan is like a roaring lion seeking those he may devour. And we cannot ignore this this campaign against righteousness in our country. We can no longer ignore the fact that we're letting sin come in and be justified. A friend of mine said some years ago, sin held in the dark corners, and now it's right out in the open. It's in the hallway of our school and the nation.
But the challenge remains that, there may be those that don't share our faith. They may even be, strongly opposed to it. But that's different than those that would do violence and would do destruction. And, like the Bethel AME in Charleston, if I remember the story correctly, he entered the church and, I think they recognized something was off, but they welcomed him in to do Bible study with them, hoping that would be the right thing to do. And, and if I remember it correctly, he did for a time sit with them until whatever set them off. And so it came out of nowhere for them. They thought they were doing the right thing. And it just remains a challenge. It's that risk assessment that, doesn't come naturally to everybody. And so, that's where the security part comes in, is because your average church attendee or pastor is thinking in a very different mindset than a security officer or public safety officer or whatever it's called. The point of view that they would have is just different.
You know, you touched on one of the most tragic of all of them out there. It wasn't Bethel, it was Mother Emanuel, AME.
Mother Emanuel, excuse me.
And you know, the anger that he had, and he was there very deliberately to kill people. He had come for that one reason and one reason only. And he did sit there for over 50 minutes without ever saying a word.
Right.
And towards the end of it is when he jumped up and just started just ruthlessly killing people.
Yeah.
And one of the stories that came out of that was a young man by the name of Tawanza Sanders. And Tawanza was the one who stopped him, stood in between him. He'd just seen what that 45 ACP did to his pastor's head, to other people around the table. And as Tawanza saw him going around the table and shooting people, and of course you can imagine people are jumping up and starting to run, and chaos is taking over. But Tawanza stood between that barrel of that gun and his 87-year-old Aunt Susie Jackson.
Right.
And he pleaded with that guy to stop.
Right.
And he said, "Sir, why are you doing this?" And that's when the idiot said all the stupid things he did about black people. And I've never repeated them. I won't. They're not worthy of repeating because they came from the mouth of an idiot. And then Tawanza himself was shot, dropped to the floor, and then he shot his 87-year-old aunt, Susie Jackson.
Yeah.
And as Tawanza lay dying, he was with his dying breath stroking the hands of his Aunt Susie, telling her it'd be okay. And the reason we know this is because Tawanza's own mother was laying on the floor, Felicia Sanders, laying on one of her grandchildren to protect that grandchild, and watched all this unfold in front of her eyes. And she testified of all this in the trial. And to me, Tawanza Sanders is one of those people I want to meet when I get to heaven, because he had protection in his heart. He, like so many of these people, had no military background. He had no law enforcement background, but he recognized pure evil when he saw it. And he was willing to put himself between the violence of a 45 caliber gun and another innocent victim and try to stop that. We need that type of people in every church, every small church, every large church. Listen, there's only a dozen people in that after church Bible study that night. They'd already had their main Bible study, their main Wednesday evening service, and this was a subgroup of the most dedicated people who were meeting on the lower level, on the ground level, the first floor.
Right.
When he came in and killed them. So these were people who absolutely represented the heart of Christ. I've walked that church. I've met some of their people. They're some of the most beautiful people on the face of the earth. We disagree on some political issues, and that's okay. And that gets back to what you said a while ago. You put people in the same room, they're going to have some disagreements. But we are united in the fact that we need to protect the innocent.
Yeah, that's the thing is, you know, people can disagree, you know, that's the beautiful part of our country, you know, but, you know, we all have to unite around the value of human life. And, you know, the people that would perpetrate these types of things don't share that value for human life, obviously, you know, for whatever motivation or reason. Yeah, it's there's so many I mean, one of the statistics that jumps out at me, which is, you know, it goes directly to this, you know, targeted hate, is that, you know, people of the Jewish faith represent like 3% of our population, but hate crimes, you know, everything from vandalism up to, you know, personal violence, is over 50% of the religious targeted crimes, you know. So, you know, whatever the motivation, you know, it doesn't matter. It's a matter of knowing that wherever there are people of faith and belief and, ethnicity and color and what have you, anything that is different than the perpetrator, he could find, a reason in his distorted mind to do violence. And unfortunately, that means that all of us need to be prepared for that.
You're right, and I don't disagree with that. I absolutely agree with that. But here's one of the things in my study that I've tracked through the years. When you look at just deadly force incidents, forget hate crime, because as I've said, that's an agenda-driven, a legislative agenda-driven thing to port more finances and more awareness towards specific people groups. When you take the word hate crime out of it, and you just look at deadly force incidents, as far as people who have been killed or threatened at a faith-based organization, the Jewish population is 1.2% of those. 1.2%. So the violence in people's heart is what we need to be looking at, not hate crime legislation. That's taking our eye off the ball. Yeah. The fact of the matter is, there is violence in man's heart, and that pretty much follows the population. I mean, the biggest churches that have the most deadly force incident are Baptist and Catholic. Well, those are the two biggest churches in America. No denomination is exempt, including the Buddhist, because of this violence that's in man's heart. And you're probably picking up on it that I have a real problem with hate crime legislation.
I don't want to go down that. That's kind of a different kind of, subject matter.
It is.
I guess, to my point, I should maybe just rephrase it and, talk about targeted crime rather than,
targeted violence. Crime. Yep.
Because that's hate crime is a definition, which is a little bit different than what I'm really talking about. I'm talking about targeted, crime. So targeted at a specific group or people. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you talk about targeted violence, one of the things that comes into the scope is domestic violence. That is huge in faith-based organizations. A faith-based organization, no matter what denomination, what theology, we're burying our heads in the sand if we don't acknowledge that there's tense relationships in our congregation. I don't care what your denomination is, you have relationships that are going off the rails.
Yeah, I can't remember which incident it was or when. This has just popped into my mind as you said that, but there was an incident where the pastor, I believe, was giving a couple some counseling, and in this gentleman's mind, he felt as if he wasn't getting a fair shake, and took it not only out on his wife, but also, I think, on some of either it was destruction or maybe there was violence. I don't recall. I didn't prepare for this this thought, but I remember that, and to your point is that, yeah, I mean, we're dealing oftentimes, like us all, we're all broken in some way, right. And oftentimes the church, either the pastor or part of the staff is trying to help that person or that couple through, some kind of bad situation, and that puts them squarely in the sights of a potentially explosive situation.
Yep. The FBSN has people across the country who are very involved in this new conversation of preventing targeted violence. And that's a new buzzword in all the three-digit law enforcement agencies who are trying to lead discussions on curtailing the mass killings and all of this. This new buzzword is targeted violence. And I'm glad that we're at the table on that. I'm glad the FBSN has various seats at the table in different regions across the country. I've participated in some of those myself, and other board members have, and other members across the country. So that is important. And I also want to make sure that it's not focusing on just targeted violence of any specific people groups, but that we are dealing with the reality that there's a lot of different people groups that this targeted violence goes against. And one of those is the Christian community. There is a great level of hate out there for the Christian community and everything that we stand for in morality. And I can't tolerate that any more than I can tolerate some idiot like attack the Mother Emanuel AME. I will come against that hard my entire life. I have a passion to go against this evil, and I don't care what the denomination or the people group looks like. It is evil, it will hurt, and it's from the gates of hell. You know, we've just had a situation right there in your state. I'm sure you're aware of the little boy who was taken out of the church in Roanoke. And I haven't looked into the news in the last 2 hours. Here we are in the first 24 hours. We've just gone beyond that. And this little boy was taken out of the church. Who cares what color he is or what the church denomination is? There is a little 2-year-old boy whose life is in jeopardy. Absolutely. That's what I'm passionate about, Rich, is that churches like that be intentional about the protection of their people. I love Matthew, the 6th chapter, where Jesus told us, don't worry about what you're going to eat, drink, or wear. It's one of the best passages in the scripture, but it says, don't worry about those things. Worry is a mild case of atheism. We shouldn't worry about it. But you know, Rich, I don't know anybody in the world who sits up in the morning and raises their hand and clothes fall down on them, and then they get manna thrown in their mouth and get a heavenly mist to hydrate them. We have to be intentional about the things that we procure and manage, that we eat, drink, and wear. Security and safety of the people in your church is the same thing. Yes, God provides. I absolutely believe that. I believe our chief of security watches our six better than anybody could. I believe no amount of training we could do can make up for that heavenly protection that we have. I believe in it. I've seen it work. I believe God protects us. But I also believe we have to be intentional in procuring the safety of our people. And whether you're a small church in Roanoke, Virginia, that needs people making sure that no child walks out of the nursery with somebody they don't know, or whether you're a mega church with a leader that's a lightning rod to every terrorist in the world, you've got to be intentional about it. You know, listen, David was a warrior. You know, King David, I mean, there's real blood on his sword. He was a warrior. He was a fighter. He was a champion. He was a king. He was a powerful, powerful man. He had a bodyguard. You know, Benaiah was David's bodyguard. You know, would David say, God will provide, God will protect me? Paul was escorted by people. And when you look at that word escort, they were with him for security reasons. Even the angels came to Joseph and Mary and told them what to do with baby Jesus, where to go, what to do. They didn't just sit back and say, y'all just stay right here. We're going to come in the middle of the night and we're going to stop this. No, Joseph and Mary had to do something intentional to protect the Savior that we worship today. Could God have intervened? Sure, he could have, but he chose to let Joseph and Mary protect him. And we still have so many pastors and leaders across the country that say, security ain't going to be here. God's going to provide our security. And that's a dangerous, dangerous path to take.
Well, that's the essence of your message is, you know, kind of wake up and be aware that, you know, we are not safe in our houses of worship and we must prepare for it. And I understand you have some seminars coming up in the not too distant future, I think.
We do. One of the biggest is every year we have what we call the SOS. It's the Security Operations Summit. And this year we're expecting 400 people from 45 states. It's going to be in Houston, Texas in July. Got some great speakers. One of our speakers is Frank Pomeroy, who is the pastor of the church where 26 were killed. You know, these are people who have really experienced it, and it's going to be in a church where the director of that security at Second Baptist Church in Houston has been the director of security there since 1984. 1984. These are
when is that supposed to be?
July 22nd through the 24th, and folks can get information on that on our website. But when we do these security operations summits, we want people speaking to our people who are seasoned veterans and who present to them their lessons learned through life. And it's going to be just a great time. Doug Burig will be there. Doug Burig was the lead law enforcement officer on the ground when the 5 Amish schoolgirls were killed there at West Nichols Mine. His heart is that all faith-based churches, all faith-based schools have some sort of intentional readiness. And that's driven by a man who saw the horror of not having any protection. And you know, we bring together such professionals in a way that sends these security operators, you've heard me refer to them as responsible defenders, home with lessons learned that they can apply for their church.
Well, if you will send me some of the information on that and some websites, etc., I'll attach them as part of this video. So when it gets uploaded to YouTube, that information will be accessible for people.
Thank you so much, Rich. We appreciate that. On behalf of the board and the members, we appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, and I appreciate you taking a little time to speak with us today. I hope that somebody out there hears the alarm bell you're sounding and will start to rethink, or maybe we'll reach out to their church leadership and ask, you know, what's being planned and what's being done, and maybe, you know, push for more to be done. Anything that any organization can do to be better prepared just might save a life. So that's the ultimate goal, and that's the reason I had you on today. So I thank you for that.
Rich, thank you so much. I am so honored that you asked me to be on here, and I just asked the Lord and would bless your steps and enlarge your steps and let this be a success. I hope everybody that tunes in will find out a little better way to do things right in the kingdom.
Well, I hope my my footsteps enlarges in terms of my YouTube audience. I think we're putting up information that hopefully is helpful to whoever may listen. So we're new, we're growing, you know, trying to get the word out there. So anything you can do to help me in that regard is also appreciated. So thank you again, Carl.
I already decided to send you.
Well, I appreciate any help you can help in that regard, and I deeply appreciate the time you took with us today. So with that, I'll again just say thank you and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. I hope so too, Rich.
Okay. Take care of yourself. God bless.
You too.